last presenter before the break is also from Australia, but has been hanging around the States for the last few months. They're going to be talking about teaching kids web dev, hopefully with Python. Please make welcome Matt.
Thank you. Alrighty, can you all hear me okay? My slides are clearly visible? Awesome. Okay, let's do the thing. So my name's Matt. I use they, them pronouns. You can find me on the internet using my handle Mattcen, M-A-T-T-C-E-N. And I'm here to talk to you about teaching kids web dev using Python. That's too many clicks. That's a click. These are my slides. Well, this is a link to my slides. If you would like to follow along, there will be speaker notes on that version if you would like, but also the link is up the top right-hand corner. If you go via GitHub, it'll be there. I'd like to, point out that I'm delivering this presentation on the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, and I honor their knowledge and stewardship and care that with which they've tended this land throughout history, and I recognize the deep and lasting damage that colonization has inflicted on them. And I pledge to do my best to respect, learn from, and support these peoples. And I think we can all do better. Okay, so there is a little bit of proprietary software in this talk. This slide is here because I gave this talk 2 weeks ago at FOSSY. And that's a free and open source software conference. So I'm presenting from my Mac, which is running macOS. The slides are hosted on GitHub, and I'm going to be mentioning a couple of extensions for Visual Studio Code that are proprietary, but for which I believe there are open source alternatives, which I will mention later. Cool. Come on, click. There we go. So I am a Scout leader in Australia. And I am a perpetual volunteer, and my background professionally is in Linux systems admin and software development. I really enjoy solving problems and developing systems, as well as teaching. So the overview of this talk is that I'm going to give you a little bit of a background into my scouting history, the inception of the course that I'm going to be discussing, its objectives, logistics, the server and client-side details of the infrastructure that we used, a bit of a recount of how our course went, and some of the lessons learned. So it's going to be a combination of both kind of story time and some technical details. So my history in scouting. I am a scout leader in Australia. Some folks might think of Boy Scouts when I mention this. Camping, hiking, constructing things with wood, or Girl Scouts and cookies and the various other stuff that they do that I don't know much about. In Scouts Australia, we have an all-gender, all-inclusive organisation that is part of the World Scout Organisation, and we have youth from 5 to 26 years old. We don't just do outdoor stuff anymore, though that is still a big part of what we do. We basically do anything that the Scouts want, as long as it's legal for them to do so at their age, and that we have professionals who can facilitate it in a way that is safe. We are a youth leading adults supporting organisation, which means that basically the Scouts say, we want to do this, and we say, all right, how are we going to do that? And we enable them to make that happen with whatever guidance is appropriate. Over the past few years, Scouts Australia have updated their award scheme to recognise youth achievement. It's now broader and less prescriptive. One of the new special interest areas that we have is STEM and innovation, under which IT obviously falls. So I've been involved since I was 8 years old. And besides outdoor skills and life skills, I learned things like planning a healthy menu, creating shopping lists, cooking, budgeting, packing for a multi-day camp, packing and tying down a trailer, leading peers without direct adult oversight. So it's a whole bunch of life skills stuff in addition to the conventional outdoor stuff that we all know as a stereotype, I think. So when I turned 18, I took a break and went to university for a few years, and 3 years later, I realized that I was spending my life staring at screens for work, study, and play, and I needed a bit of an escape. So I became a scout leader in 2008, dealing with 11 to 15-year-old youth, and since then, I have also been a leader of adults, which is like training other leaders, as well as an activity leader facilitating statewide events for Scouts of all ages. And then I realized that I had come full circle because I increasingly found myself staring at a screen for my Scout work, using my IT skills within Scouting to make open topographic maps for some of our hikes, using open data, making various little web apps to facilitate some of the events that we were running, doing a lot of this stuff in Python and Django. And while I did have some fellow Scout leaders who were also IT folks, a lot of this particular work fell to me. So we decided that while we wouldn't be around forever, so we needed a bit of a succession plan. So we decided on this thing called Scout Hack. So to leverage our youth leading, adult supporting heritage, we decided to hand down to youth some of the work that we had been doing, assuming they were interested and felt that it was worth continuing. So we were going to teach the youth a little bit about IT, give them the agency to decide the direction of where we were going. My friend Luke, who is a Scout leader with me, suggested that we run a tech camp to teach basic web dev and maybe some ops sysadmin stuff. This was inspired by a hackathon that we had both run called GovHack in Australia. So we decided to coin the term Scout Hack and run a 2-day camp during which we would do all of this teaching. And because we were like in the middle of the lockdowns of the pandemic, we planned this entire thing with a few weeks in advance over Jitsi video calls, which added a whole bunch of exciting challenges. So, the syllabus, we decided to teach HTML, CSS, an intro to some level of server-side scripting. This was all very ambitious for a weekend. The 11 to 15-year-olds were going to have like varying levels of competence, and we decided they didn't need to retain all of the details. We just wanted to walk them through step by step how to do all of the things, and then they can decide if they're interested whether they want to go and research it in greater detail. Or potentially we could run a Scout Hack 2.0 later on if there was interest. So, event logistics. What are we going to need? We decided that to optimize for accessibility, we don't require BYO devices. We also realized that that would allow homogeneity across our fleet to ensure that we didn't have Scouts using different pieces of software or hardware, which was going to be a whole headache. So we found some old laptops that were being decommissioned by a school, probably older than some of the Scouts these days. I think they were from like 2011. And we installed a lightweight Linux distribution and development environment, and managed to also find some VGA monitors and external keyboards and mouse so that they could have their 2 screens and have like a proper setup where they would have a web browser on one side and their code editor open on the other. Okay, I am a little behind. This is fine. So this is the room setup that we had. We have a projector, 2 projector screens up the front with about 20 computer desks littered around in little pods so that the Scouts can work in little groups or patrols to help each other solve their problems. We managed to do this in a self-contained Scout camp that has bunk beds, kitchen, bathrooms, the large dining/classroom space, and new electrical wiring, which was important given that some of our monitors were a bit old and required a lot of power. But we managed to mostly not trip the circuit breakers. We also had no internet. So how do you teach web development without internet? We decided to run a local server, which kids could have run on their local computers, but we also wanted them to be able to access each other's content. So we had to go a little bit further than that. The server-side technical details were that we found a rack mount server that that some company was getting rid of. I don't remember the details. We grabbed a bunch of network switches, a whole lot of network cables, and we decided to give the Scouts a full virtual private server, which was going to be running a web server. They could run the web server themselves, install packages that they needed, and store all of their files. Each Scout was going to get an Ubuntu Docker container with an SSH server, a standard user account with full sudo access. Technically, I did this using SSH Pieper, which is a reverse proxy for SSH that basically intercepts SSH connections and then routes them where they need to go. I wouldn't recommend this in production, but for the purposes of teaching, it was going to work just fine. We also used traffic, which is a reverse HTTP proxy, and set up local DNS so that anything .scouthack would point at the server and would route to the appropriate containers. So how do we teach scouts to SSH to a server without going into gory detail? We decided on the client side that we were going to give them Ubuntu laptops running XFCE desktop environment. I installed SSH on them so that I could log in and do admin tasks if necessary. They were also running Firefox and Visual Studio Code with the remote VS Code extension, which is, as far as I know, the only closed source component of this entire infrastructure, and I believe there's an open alternative to it. And then I used Clonezilla to image all of the other laptops over UDP multicast, which is magic. I imaged 20 laptops in under half an hour, I think. So highly recommend. So during the course, scouts arrived on Friday evening. We had them plug in their computers, which isn't super hard: power, monitor, Ethernet cable, keyboard, mouse. But like a lot of these scouts haven't necessarily dealt with a desktop or laptop computer before that they've had to put together, so it was still an experience for them. They tried to get online. No internet, what's going on? Why can't you get online, scouts? Oh, well, we're not on the Wi-Fi. I'm like, do you need Wi-Fi to get on the internet? And so basically we ended up having this using this as a teaching moment to teach them the distinctions between a local area network, a Wi-Fi network, which could also be a local area network, and the internet. And we said, look, you're on the LAN, but there is no upstream internet. There is technically Wi-Fi, but only we instructors are going to be using it, so you don't need to worry about it. And so that gave them a little bit of the foundation of like how networks work. This is the classroom setup now that we've got a whole bunch of scouts in it. We've got some stuff going on the projector, and they all seem relatively engaged, although you can only see their backs, so you can't tell how happy they are. So that was Friday evening, and we decided that we didn't want to go too deep before they had to go to bed, so we called it a night. I set up a Minetest server for them to join. So Minetest is an open source alternative to Minecraft. And we discovered some interesting network effects happening, which was that one scout who had brought their own laptop had the official Minecraft client on their computer and was feeling like quite superior because, oh, I've got the official thing and not that like aftermarket, like open source stuff. And then they realized that they were playing alone, while all of the other scouts had, were on the server together, and they're like, oh, can you install Minetest on my laptop for me? So that was kind of fun. And so it just goes to show that like often it's the community more than the software that matters. So the following morning after breakfast, we decided to ask the scouts how computers work. And because I have an oft frustrating literal mindedness, Luke, who was helping me to run the course, decided to leverage it by having me make a sandwich. This is how that turned out. So this is me holding a knife in a very scary stabbing motion. So given a loaf of bread in a plastic bag, a tub of water, some Vegemite or jam, a knife, and a plate, I was deliberately misinterpreting the instructions that the scouts were giving me by following them to the letter and demonstrating the value of precision, with hilarious results. So, they'd say, pick up the knife, and I would pick it up in the wrong orientation. And then they would tell me to, spread some spread onto the plate, which I did very dutifully, completely missing the bread. This is how one tries to open a jar by pulling the twist top. Do not recommend. Eventually, I got my sandwich and was able to have breakfast. So I think that was, like, we've done that repeatedly during our sessions now, and I think that it's a really good demonstration to kick off the core of the course. Okay, so after we had that all done, we got the scouts to set up their Visual Studio Code environment. So we told them to open VS Code, use the remote SSH session extension to connect to username at username.scouthack, and enter in the password that we'd given them, and had them open the code folder that we had pre-created. And then we had them create an index.html file, put some text in it, and save the file. Use the VS Code keyboard shortcut to open a terminal, and then run a Python web server, Python -m http://server/80, hit enter, and then we had them open Firefox and browse to username.scouthack, and lo and behold, there is the text that they had written. And of course, they could also browse to each other's websites and see what other ridiculous text each other had written. So after we did that, we decided to embellish that file a little bit further, having them insert text, headers, line breaks, various code formatting, text formatting, images. We had them create another HTML file and then link to it. So all of the basic HTML stuff, lists, tables, just so that they had a bit of an idea of the foundations of HTML without going into exactly how they needed to do everything. And then we broke for lunch before presenting some stuff on CSS. We started by introducing CSS colors, describing how some of them could be referred to by name, while the rest needed RGB color codes. I think we also mentioned that HSL, or hue, saturation, luminescence, was a thing, but didn't go into the details. We did mention that color codes could be in decimal or in hexadecimal, depending on how you wanted to present them. And we also found that it was really useful that VS Code will show you a preview of the color if you give it a hex code in the text editor, and they can click on it, and it will give them a color wheel with which they can select colors. So we had them style their web page initially using a style attribute on an element, then by creating a style tag in the head of their HTML, and eventually moving that into a separate styles.css file. And they picked some of the most garish colors. From an accessibility perspective, I almost cried, but it's fine, it was a learning experience. And then to speed things up a little bit, we taught them a little bit of Bootstrap, just showing how pre-built CSS classes could allow for a bit more rapid styling. I am yet to go and investigate Tailwind, but I think that it could be a good thing for them as well. So we managed to make the websites look a little bit less 1990s. And then by that time it was like evening on the Saturday, so naturally we had pizza and mind test. Okay, so the following morning, so this is the last day of the event, we decided we were going to get them to build a Python Flask web server. The goal was for them to be able to submit program ideas, a program idea for like something that a Scout group might want to do, and then list out the submitted ideas so that we could see what ideas people had. So it was a web form that had an input box labeled author and a text area labeled idea and a submit button. Nothing super complex. So the way I ended up doing this was I synthesized a Git repository where every commit was one step that they had to follow, and I wrote a tiny shell script that looped through the Git repository and was able to show them, okay, here is, now that the code has reloaded, here is how it should look after you finish this step. Here is the git diff appearing in a Forge. We used Forge.io, which is an open source alternative to GitHub. And I showed them the diff and said, these are the lines that you need to change. Off they went and did that. And then I would hit enter and go to the next step. So that worked really well. Come on. I like my clicker. So basically, I might just go through, yeah, we can do this. I'm going to go through some of the code that we wrote rather than just give you the basics. Click. Okay, so basically we had them initialize a Flask app. Initially we had 2 routes to go to the root of the web server and then the index.html, which was already there because we wanted that to continue to work. And we had it open on port 80, which is what traffic was expecting. After that, we got them to render a new template called patrol.html, which was where their content was going to be. We then added a new program route, which was going to have a separate page where they would have their web form into which they could submit their program ideas. And then we got the submission process sorted out. So I decided to use CSVs as a database because it was going to be a lot simpler than trying to teach them how to initialize SQLite or all of that. It was just like, let's just use CSVs. That way they can open the plain text and have a look at it as well. So we import CSV, we set a database file, we set its, specify its field names of author and idea, and then we create our new program route, which checks that author and idea have been submitted from the form, opens the database or the CSV file in append mode, and drops a line in to the CSV file, and then takes them back to their homepage or wherever. And then the counterpart to that is the list of programs, which opens up the CSV file, reads all of the things out of it, and then displays it in a list in the web browser. And then we updated the route for the submission page so that it would go to, here is your list. And that was it. So that worked quite well. And then we let the scouts tweak their websites as they wished, add some more garish colors, all of that stuff. And then we had them shut down their computers and disassemble them, pack up their gear and prepare to go home. And we decided that we would zip up all of their websites and email them a link after they got home so that they could continue playing with them later on if they wished. So some of the lessons that we learned were that a lot of the scouts really struggled with the dexterity required for typing a bunch of the code. I suspect this might be because a lot of young people these days are growing up with touchscreens and not as frequently using keyboards and mice. And this wasn't a huge deal with HTML or CSS because your website might just not look exactly the way you expect it to, and that might be fine. But Python is less forgiving, and some of the trivial syntax errors really got in the way. And we didn't have the time to teach them how to debug all of this, so we kind of had to rush through and just work out exactly what was going on. I would diff some of the scouts' code against my own just to see, oh, that's the line that they've made a typo on, just to speed things up. And because I could SSH to each of their Docker containers, I might just fix it on the fly without even having to go to their computer, which was really handy. One of the things that I'd like to use in future is that given Flask has workzug in the background, I'd like to use its interactive web-based debugger, but I don't know if that's going to be too complicated for the scouts, so stay tuned and we'll see how that goes. We really kind of winged the coursework the first couple of times. That did work initially, but to reduce ongoing effort, we want to tighten up the material further. For example, the most recent time we ran this course, I couldn't reuse my Git repository of steps for the Flask app because the starting point was based on the HTML and CSS work that had already been done, and it was not the same as the previous time that we had done it because they had altered some of the previous coursework, which meant that I had to do this huge overhaul overnight and then check all of the scouts' code to make sure that they'd hit all of the key criteria to make sure that it was actually going to be transformable into the final result. And then there were more typos even after I did that because somehow, I don't understand how, but some scouts I think managed to select and then accidentally hit a key to delete a huge block of their code and then save their file. And then I would, it was a bit fun. And then I'd be like, so you're getting an error, oh, where is all of that code gone? Hang about, let me just diff that against mine and just drop that entire code block back in. So that's a tricky thing to deal with, and I haven't got a good answer for that yet, but I'm thinking about it. One of the possibilities is to give the scouts a template at the start of each session so that we have a clear starting point. But even so, we might have lose people in the middle of a session. The other alternatives are to maybe use Jupyter Lab. As Moshe was mentioning yesterday, that could allow us to have much more discrete code blocks, and we could also still have that do a web server type thing. The main reason we stuck with VS Code rather than something web-based was because it's easy for scouts to set it up at home. But using Jupyter Lite might mitigate that as well, aside from the fact that we can't do the whole web server thing. I don't know. We'll see. So we had really productive, really positive feedback from the attendees and parents. We've had several returning members, so we've run 3 so far, and one of the scouts has come back at least once and has recently asked when we're doing the next one, so I feel like that's a win. We would like to, in future, do a Webdev 2.0, where we teach a little bit more Flask, or maybe Fast API or Django, teach some DevOps type stuff, or do like a red blue team kind of thing to do a little bit of InfoSec type stuff. I don't know. We're going to see where it goes. We're going to see where the interest lies. And that's all I've got for you. I'd like to thank Luke Byrnes, who came up with this whole idea, Pieper Cafe in Portland, where I wrote a large chunk of this talk, FOSSY and North Bay for letting me speak and present this talk, and for Andy King for the photos. And thank you.
Thank you, Matt.